Welcome to today's USDA Rural Telecommunications Infrastructure Loan Program webinar. My name is Doug Martin. I'm a Management and Program Analyst with the Technical Assistance Branch, Policy and Outreach Division, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be joined by an esteemed panel of presenters and panelists. We have Shekinah Pepper. He is Acting Assistant Administrator for the Loan Origination and Approval Division. Scott Steiner is Engineering Branch Chief for the Loan Origination and Approval Division. Michael Wilbur, Operations Branch Chief for the Loan Origination and Approval Division. Chris Collins is Engineering Branch Chief for the Policy and Outreach Division. Joan Kaiser is Management and Program Analyst for the Policy and Outreach Division Operations Branch. Kristen Lowe is Operations Branch Chief for the Policy and Operations Division Branch. We also are joined by Russ Japuntich, who is Environmental Protection Specialist with the Electric Program. Our agenda today is going to cover a few key areas: process improvements from Michael Wilbur. We'll learn about some system enhancements from Joan Kaiser. Chris Collins will present on key considerations for environmental, and then we'll follow up, as Scott said, with some question and answers that you may have. Next slide, please. With that, I'll turn it over to process improvements. Michael Wilbur, Operations Branch Chief for the Loan Origination and Approval Division. Michael?
Thank you, Doug. So a quick introduction. My team is mainly responsible for the financial review of all applications that come into Rural Utility Service Telecom Division, whether it's distance learning, telemedicine, infrastructure, which we're talking about today, or Community Connect and Reconnect. The process improvements we have are made possible by the system enhancements that will be covered in the remaining piece of this webinar. Next slide. So one of our first process improvements is we've modified how we're reviewing infrastructure loans from a completeness standpoint. The old way is we would get the application in, review it for just completeness, send a letter out to the applicant, either asking for additional information or telling them the application is complete. We've migrated from that and kind of modeled our review after the Reconnect process. So we're now calling the application completeness review the L1 review. The new setup that we're moving forward with involves getting the GFR and the applicant together with my team to discuss any deficiencies or items that might need attention in the application, and not necessarily going back and forth with returning an application and resubmitting it. Things we can get done a little bit quicker when we involve the applicant with this. So that's something we're doing moving forward. This has led to a decreased processing time where we are involving the applicant in our review process, where my team has direct contact with the GFR, and then the engineer and my loan specialist working with you to get everything we need in the application. We also streamlined the financial feasibility review. Now that's part of the L2 review. This review used to take a lot longer due to basically having to use several different workbooks and several different processes that involve different divisions. Now we're using the financial feasibility workbook that was in Reconnect. We've adapted that for infrastructure, which allows us to look at things a lot faster. Next slide, please. Along with the improvements to the application completeness or L1 review and the financial feasibility review, we are now using as a credit document the L2 summary, which is basically the credit analysis and engineering and environmental analysis of the whole project. We're mirroring that after the Reconnect program, basically to make things easier and more standardized across the board. This also goes, the next piece goes into what I talked about at the beginning, which is the process or the system improvements that have been made allow for document preparation to be generated out of our new system on the back side of the application intake. So when we go through the approval process and we get that documented, we can go straight into document preparation with all our templates. Another process improvement that will be talked about a little bit later is the change in the NFSA subscriber projections. In the system, we no longer are going to require a separate breakout for NFSA subscriber projections, where you're going to have to basically tell us, how many subscribers you are projecting for that year in the NFSA. That's no longer going to be in the intake system moving forward. However, we will need information on the NFSA subscribers, just not as detailed as what was required in the system before. And basically that will be covered in the application guide that should be posted on our website in the coming days. We also have, again, basing things off Reconnect and trying to make things more standardized. We've included a loan and financial network workbook that will help you and putting in your financials into the intake system. That is available for download on the To Apply tab under the application resources section. So those are some of the process improvements we have. It has decreased processing time, and it has kind of standardized our review for a lot of our programs, not just infrastructure. With that, we can go to the next slide, and Doug, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Michael. Let's go on to Joan Kaiser to talk a little bit about system enhancements. Joan?
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Just turn my camera on just so I can say a quick hello to everybody. Hope you're all doing well, and thanks for joining us. We've got a lot of highlights to cover in a fairly short amount of time. This slide shows you where all the changes are. I am going to say, see that last bullet, please go to the system user manual for full details on the way the system is going to work now. Next slide, please. So starting with recent activity, we've had two major releases in August and in November of this year. Thanks, Nicole, for putting the system user manual link in the chat for everybody. Much appreciated. Those releases did a number of things. We built and deployed a full end-to-end review module for our staff, which I'll talk about the impact on stakeholders in a minute. That's really important so that our staff can make sure that they've got all of the information in the same place. We made a bunch of other behind-the-scenes changes to smooth the way the system works. We also did some R&C enhancements. And we standardized the look and feel of intake, which is what I'm going to call the application system, just to make the components more accessible to all types of users and all users. And the biggest thing we did was made a lot of changes to the environmental tab, which I will talk about in a couple of minutes. Most of my remarks on the system enhancements today are going to follow our, if you're familiar with intake, our famous green navigation bar. So just running through the sections that have changed. Next slide, please. Before we hop into that navigation bar and intake, I want to talk a moment about the review module. This is behind the scenes. As an external stakeholder, you're never going to see it. So why should you care? Well, you should care because this work is going to facilitate faster, more thorough reviews by Michael and Scott Steiner and their team in Load. The application data and review data are now linked on a single platform, which speeds a reviewer access to information. There's a lot less time hunting and emailing for documents, so there's going to be more time for reviews. In addition, we've built out the ability to generate key documents, which reduces the time from award approval to document execution. You can see the document list here on the screen. We've also consolidated all of our sort of additional information requests. That might be requests for additional information from a reviewer in Load or an environmental reviewer. And we have the ability to send the application back to you within intake, requesting specified updates that you can do right in intake and resubmit. This is going to cut down on the back and forth a lot. It's going to cut down on flurries of emails, and it's going to make it easier for both you and us to track status on if we ask you for something additional. And keep in mind that ability to send the application back to you in intake is pre-existing functionality. We built that several releases ago. It's just now gaining speed because having the review module in the same platform means that we'll be able to access the speed and power of that for you. Next slide, please. Couple of other things to talk about as we move into the system enhancements. Just a couple of reminders. Logging into the system as of October of 2024, there are no more e-authentication logins. You must use login.gov. We do have resources available for that if you need to figure out how to go ahead and do that. Also, just a reminder for those of you with an existing account in our intake system, it's helpful to go in maybe once a year, just look over your information in the account section, make sure that all of your documents are up to date before you submit an application. That way you're not scrambling at the last minute to make sure that we have the most updated set of bylaws, for example. So that's going to be one less thing that we're going to sort of have to ping you about. Next slide. So here's the first change. I'm sorry, I had one more slide. I got ahead of myself on my links. This particular item, the public searchable map database, this is pre-existing functionality as well. It was released in a prior release. This is public, and it's going to help you quickly determine by using filters and searching the areas that your PFSA might overlap before you start committing time to your application. And again, the link is here, and I'm hoping that Nicole will be able to put the link in chat for us as well. We've reconfigured and rejiggered that map so it's very strong and very flexible, and the maps are no longer delineated specifically by program. You can go in here and look at all of the programs, one of the programs, however many you need. Next slide, please. And so now we actually are going into the intake system. This is actually before the green navigation bar. This is when you're starting a new application. You're going to see a new required question about whether you intend to refinance anything with this application. Just choose yes or no. And the answer to this question is going to drive which pages show under the financials section of the application. And keep in mind, if you have to change this answer, you're going to have to come back and create a new application because the application workflow drives what you see in the rest of the application. So if you have to make a change up front, that's going to change everything that you're going to see later on. Next slide. So moving into project information, first and foremost, the legal opinion upload has been removed. If we need the legal opinion, we'll ask for it later. And as Michael previously mentioned, we pulled the non-funded service area or NFSA information out of intake. The initial question was always on the project information page, and that question drove functionality throughout the rest of the application. So again, we did pull it from here. You don't have to worry about NFSAs anymore. We do have a new required upload with regard to the intercreditor agreement, and there's a new required question on the page. You need to specify your funding type. Are you going to use a cost of money loan, a federal financing bank loan, or a combination of the two? And finally, on the project information page, we reworked the tribal questions so that intake will show you only the questions that apply to your application based on your answers. Next slide, please. Moving into the service area maps, not a lot going on here, but a couple of things we did want to highlight for you. Again, we removed the ability to do NFSAs in the service area map. We also added a new button. It's called Download Geometry. If you want to save your data that you've uploaded, whether it's a polygon or any other information, if you want to save that, maybe you can use that Download Geometry to save everything you've put on the map. So that can be handy if you need to review it later, in case you need to make changes in our map, you'll have a record. You can do things like that with it. We also updated a couple of the layers on the map. We added a new layer called Federally Funded Broadband Projects. It's going to show you areas where other federal agencies are funding broadband that may or may not duplicate with your particular project so that you can evaluate that. We also coordinated and combined the tribal layers so that they're a little easier to handle. Next up, next slide, please. Moving into the network section of the application. Again, we pulled the NFSAs from the capital investment workbook, the capital investment schedule, and all the other pages that rely on information from those two. And under the capital investment workbook, service area costs don't have to be broken out by PFSAs anymore, or proposed funded service areas. You can just group them all together, and this is going to save you some time and effort. And finally, on the network side, we added two new other costs, capital leases and indefeasible right of use agreements, so that those are eligible for your use as well. Next slide. Moving into the financial section, again, NFSAs is kind of the big headline here. We pulled it from a lot of places in the financials. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just know that you are going to save time, and this is a reduced requirement for you, so that you won't have to put that information in again. We added an eligible service to the local network services revenue pages, and that is mobile. And with regard to service offerings and subscriber projections, Michael touched on this a little while ago. You no longer have to group either service offerings or subscriber projections by PFSA. You can just do them for your entire application or project. Again, this is going to save you some time. We also added a little wrinkle on the alternate household data if you choose to use that. You can do that by PFSA so that you can get very granular on your marketing numbers if you need to use the alternate household data. Next slide, please. Moving into the long-term debt section of the financials, hopefully, if you've been in intake before, you're aware that we ask you to enter information about your long-term debt. And if you said that you intend to refinance using this application, you're going to see a new question on every window that you open to enter an item of debt. And it's going to ask you, are you requesting information for this specific note? Bear in mind, that pop-up window can be kind of large. You might have to scroll down to see the actual question, but again, it's a required question. You won't be able to save the window contents until you answer it. Next slide, please. We've also added a refinancing page to the financials. Again, you'll only see it if you answered yes to the refinancing question when you're making your application at the very beginning. The first thing you see on that refinancing page is a summary table right at the top that captures every single long-term debt item for which you answered yes on that little item pop-up window when you were logging your item of debt, the slide I just talked about. Next slide, please. That refinancing page also provides a funding information table. This actually pulls in your total project costs from the CIW and shows you the total funds that you intend to refinance so that you can see the total loan funds that you're going to be requesting. It's also a nice check if you need to go back and change an answer on one of those long-term debt items because this number looks funky for you. This gives you an opportunity to just kind of eyeball that so you can go ahead and do that. Next slide, please. Again, for refinancing, you're only going to see this if you're going to refinance. You're going to have to give us two required items, a written justification for why you intend to refinance. And assuming that you're refinancing non-RUS debt, you're going to have to provide evidence that the original loan addressed an allowable purpose under the statute and regulations. Finally, with regard to refinancing, there's a new payment table generator for the refinanced amount. Just like the payment table generator for the new construction loan, you plug in your interest rate estimate and you calculate your payments. The reason we do this is if you're requesting both new construction and refinancing in a single application, you're probably going to end up with two notes, and those notes are going to have different amortization and different payment tables. So we ask you to kind of run that twice so that you've got that information up front. Next slide. We are finally moving to the big piece that we did an awful lot of work on this year, and that is changes to the environmental tab. These changes stem from the new USDA-wide regulation that administers the National Environmental Policy Act at USDA. That was published on July 3rd, 2025. And do bear in mind that, and Chris and Russell talk about this in a little while, that we're still kind of getting our hands around some of those nuances, but we did have enough hard and fast information to go ahead and start making changes in the system for you. We did make major changes that are going to reduce the initial, and I stress that word, initial amount of environmental information that we're going to require in the application. And again, intake is going to show you only the required information that you need to supply based on the answers that you provide in the system. And keep in mind too that our US environmental staff will reach out if we need additional information. Again, probably using the ability to return that application to you in intake, giving you a detailed description of what needs to be changed or provided so that you can then just resubmit the application. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the enhanced environmental workflow. This workflow is going to essentially look the same. Number one is the only brand new item. Items 2 through 6, if you've been in intake before, you've seen them before. Everybody's going to do item 1 and item 6. Whether you do items 2 or 5 or 2 through 5 depend on how you answer certain questions in the application system. Most specifically, non-major federal actions. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to go into the details on all of these kind of step by step, but I just wanted you to get a sense of if you are not facing, if you all you're doing is a non-major federal action, you're just going to be looking at 1 and 6 here. The other steps fall into place as we drill down and decide whether we need more information based on your responses. Next slide, please. Let's talk about that new page, the environmental application detail page. It mostly asks for some very basic information, but the key thing here is that question that's got the red star beside it for non-major federal action. The answer that you supply here is going to direct how much additional environmental information we're going to require at initial application submission. Next slide, please. Before you answer that question, think about it, talk to your GFR, reach out to the RUS national staff if you need to get some help with how you formulate your answer to this. Again, this comes right out of the regulation. And again, the way you answer this question is going to determine how much more initial information might be required for your application. One thing that you need to keep in mind for this particular question, although it's just a simple yes, no radio button, you're going to have to give us a little written write-up or justification or a construction description, depending on whether you answer yes or no. So you're going to have to be prepared to write up a little bit on that. What's going to happen is RUS staff is going to take a look at that response on the non-major federal action, and they may return your application for an update requiring more information based on their evaluation of your initial information. If they concur with your information, then you may not have to give us anything else, but that's a decision for a little bit later down the line. Next slide, please. Moving into the construction map, there's not a lot of changes on the map itself, just a few things I want to talk about. You're going to see a new layer listed on the construction map, the PLSS Township Range Section layer. You don't really have to use this. It's really mainly there for RUS staff to get very granular on project locations. You're also going to see that download geometry button that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. And we have one piece of advice on the map here. This has always been kind of implicit, but we wanted to make it explicit for you. When you're designating a site, you want to make sure that the polygon that you draw covers the dimensions of everything that supports your environmental assets. Environmental assets like buildings or towers or access roads. And the list here on the slide is not all inclusive. What you want to make sure that you do is you try to account for the footprint of everything that supports your assets. So once you draw your site, you want to just kind of stop and ask yourself, does this shape really cover everything I need? And it's a little easier to kind of do that stuff up front than to try to fix it later. Next slide, please. So moving on in the environmental section, if you're not dealing exclusively with a non-major federal action, we're going to ask for both the map and the site and route descriptions. There are changes to the site and route descriptions. You're going to see revamped questions that drill down really hard on specifics for your assets. But again, Intake is only going to show you the questions that are required based on your previous responses. The big new one here is you're going to now recommend which categorical exclusions under the new regulation cover your proposed action. And they're going to be, and I'm only going to say these once and then I'm going to shorten them. 7 CFR 1B.C, 7 CFR 1B.4D, 7 CFR dot, well, sorry, 7 CFR 1B.4C and D, or NA. We're going to talk about C and D today. If you need more details, there's a lot of detail in the system user manual. Keep in mind, if you're drawing a route, if you select the 7 CFR 1B.4C for the route, you're not going to have to fill out the environmental questionnaires or EQs for your route. For sites, it works a little differently. If you select that .4C, just like we talked about for routes, for all of the assets on your site, that is your towers, your buildings, your roads, everything else, then it's going to work the same for as it did for routes. You're not going to have to fill out the EQs. But if you have a couple of different assets on your site and they have different categorical exclusions and you're going to be able to assign them by building, by tower, by access road, then things are going to change a little bit. For example, if you designate your first asset as a .4C categorical exclusion and your second asset as a .4D, you are going to have to fill out the EQs because not all of your site assets fall under that .4C categorical exclusion. Takes a little while to kind of get your head around it, but it's fairly easy to understand. Just take your time with it. And again, reach out if you have questions. Next slide, please. Moving into the site and route environmental questionnaires or EQs. Both of these questionnaires now ask for some really important narratives right up front. So if you have to fill them out, you want to take some time on these narratives. This is going to help the RUS environmental staff to fully examine your project under the new NEPA regulation. And as you can see here, there's 4 narratives. The site or route description, a description of current land use and conditions, a description of previous land use and past ground disturbances, and the purpose of the project. And I want to spend one moment on the purpose of the project. I know that if you're filling out a telecom application, we ask you for project narratives up front. This is a little different. It's a little different lens to think about your project or view your project from. The environmental staff are going to use this description to assist consulting parties or other stakeholders in the review process for either environmental or historical or cultural resources to understand why your project is important and your project's benefits. So you want to think about that one a little bit. The other thing to note here under the site and route EQs is the separate National Historic Preservation EQ is gone. Historic preservation and cultural resource questions are interwoven into the site and route EQs and into the project EQ. Next slide, please. So still in the site and route EQs, I want to talk a little bit about the historic and cultural resources changes. You're going to be asked for a narrative description of the area of potential effects, which at a minimum must include the footprint of all proposed activities within a project area, including things like staging and laydown areas, access routes, on-site and off-site borrow locations, storage areas, and any other additional areas utilized beyond the project footprint. And again, if you have a question, reach out. We'll get you an answer for that. There's also been a change in the site and route EQs on how threatened and endangered species are addressed. We've replaced the species table upload with a new upload. It's a requirement for a finding of effect determination that you're going to have to write and provide to us. We've also provided a space for you to give us the project codes you pick up over at IPAC when you get your official species letters from Fish and Wildlife Service. The environmental staff may want you to add them to your IPAC projects later on. And so having the code just simplifies the process for you and them to go ahead and do that. Next slide. Moving on to the project EQ. The biggest change here is, again, historic and cultural resources. And again, this section replaces that former National Historic Preservation Act EQ. So you want to make sure that you read and follow the extensive on-screen instructions on the requirements. Reach out through Contact Us if you have questions. And keep in mind that requirements have changed. You may be asked to upload historic properties identification report, a section 106 finding, a finding of effect letter, or previous coordination efforts. And again, our staff can help you kind of figure out what you need to provide initially or later on in the process, if you have to get this far in the documentation. Next slide, please. So the last update that I wanted to highlight in the system enhancements for you this afternoon or this morning is we did some updates to the certification section. We updated the list of required certifications to conform to current requirements coming out of executive orders and other federal policy initiatives. And then we also just moved the navigation. If you remember, it used to be on the right-hand side with blue dots. Now it's on the left-hand side with clickable links to a new menu over on the left-hand side of that page. And with that, that concludes the system enhancements. So back to you, Doug.
Fantastic information. Lots of great updates from the team. Thank you so much, Joan. All right, let's take a look at some key considerations for environmental. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Collins. Chris?
Hey, thank you, Doug. And as Joan, Chris Collins, Engineering Branch Chief, Policy and Outreach Division. I'm going to turn my video off. Just got a few slides here. Just wanted to make sure, understand if, for anyone. Also on the webinar today is Russell Pujic, and I probably just butchered his last name, so I apologize, Russell, for that. But he is with our Environmental and Historic Preservation Division, and we will be around for questions if you have any specific questions. But regarding the NEPA regulation, and Joan covered a little bit, so the new regulations, which was 7 CFR 1B, is the regulation that posted in October. They are still not finalized, so there could be some changes that come along with that before they do get finalized. And so we just want to make sure everyone understands just a little bit of word of caution here. They do replace the 7 CFR 1970, which was rural development's previous regulation. So those that does get rescinded from this new regulation. And hopefully in the next couple of months, we will have more of a final product. And then we would make any adjustments as necessary regarding application information. So, just a little warning there, the system is set up the way it is, and I do have confidence we can navigate that with any changes as necessary. So the next slide, we're going to talk about a little bit more discussion on how do you approach this. And one of the changes that Joan hit upon is the new system is approaching environmental from a project perspective. So I know under telecommunication programs, a lot of times what we see is applicants will come in and they will have a single application, but within that application, there's multiple project areas. And so this could be where you may have a centralized, a central office that you're looking at. Hey, I need to upgrade this central office. I want to upgrade my facilities over here, the network connected to this one. And so those are what we call sometimes independent utilities. We want you to approach your application with that mindset first. Instead of uploading everything under one asset type or under one type of upload, we want you to look at that in the beginning of saying, okay, here's a project that I can look at separately versus this project over here, because when you do that, you do give the environmental evaluation a little bit more flexibility on when we can clear these projects, because a single application may have multiple clearances if we determine that there are true self-sufficient projects within that. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at putting these projects together, do not artificially separate these. So if it's necessary as a whole, and there's a component that may not be directly attached, but it's necessary for that to exist, then you want to consider that as part of that project, even though it may not be directly attached. So the next slide, we're going to go a little bit more into this when we're talking about the descriptions. Joan brought up about the EQs, and you need to provide a description of your project. One thing I want to make sure everyone understands is this is not your engineering design. There is a network portion of the application. But when we get to the environmental, we want to know about your construction. Where's the network or what you're proposing to build going to be placed, and how's that going to disturb the earth? And so think about it more along that line. I know I work very closely with our environmental reviewers, and this is one of the biggest things that they have issues with is when the information provided in the application or descriptions is more on a technical nature and it doesn't help them understand, well, how does that construction take place? So keep in mind when you're building your design or your description, you want to let us know where's it at, the location, what's the method, is it going to be buried, aerial, portion of each, and how's that going to take place as far as like depths, widths, in areas of disturbance, and then the scope, the overall aspect of how it's going to reach out. Again, goes back, Joan brought up borrow sites and temporary sites. That's still scope of that project disturbance. So think about it from a disturbance nature. And then when you do put this together, we want it to make sure it's clear, concise, and relevant. Too much jargon, too many words that you may understand from a telecommunications technical aspect. It may be hard to communicate that if we do have to do consulting with other parties. So keep that in mind, that people that may be reading these descriptions, they may not know anything about telecommunications. They may not understand that boring is not the same thing as boring that's done during oil field construction and things like that. So it's good to help understand the actual scope and how your impacts will be seen. And then when you do get into those, when you do get into developing your projects, one thing for us would be good is try to keep a consistent naming. And so if you do have like certain things in your budget where you're looking at or you're describing in your area maps, like certain project names, you may have like Northeast area, Eagle Bluffs, or what have you identified within your application. Hey, it's perfectly fine to name that project the same, or provide some identifying information when creating those projects that we can link those two together to help understand that. So that's all we had for that. Just want to kind of give you all, again, a more specific discussion on how we look at and approaching the environmental information in your application. Thank you. Next slide. Oh, Q&A. Turn over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Chris. All right, we are at the question and answer portion of today's webinar. We encourage you to go ahead and submit any questions you may have. Additionally, be aware, feel free to reach out to staff at any time after the webinar. We encourage you also to reach out to your general field representative for your state. Please do that. We do have a question in the Q&A. I'll go ahead and read it. On the note of consulting, are there any relevant rules or regulations regarding fee arrangements for third-party advisors or consultants helping their clients to apply for the Rural Telecommunications Infrastructure Loan Program? I will go ahead and open that up to the panel. I'll read the question one more time. So on the note of consulting, are there any relevant rules or regulations regarding fee arrangements for third-party advisors helping their clients to apply for the program?
Do you want to
Yeah.
take that, Chris, or do you want me to?
If you want to go ahead and do it, Scott, I think I
We
understand
don't have
the
any
context.
specific regulations as far as the fees, but we do have construction procedures. So to the extent that they're contracting with organizations, they would need to follow that. And that's for the infrastructure program, 7 CFR 1753. Do you have anything you want to add there, Chris? Or I think Shekinah might have wanted to say something.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to with that, I mean, because we're talking about pre-application type expenses, with here, the big thing is it needs to be relevant to the project for the application, and there should be some type of contract in place. Because now, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, RUS form of contracts are not required until after we get past the application phase.
That's true, but I would say with environmental, it can be a little bit squishy on what the cutoff for that is. And so the contract form for signing with a professional services is not particularly complicated. So you may want to look at doing a 245 or something, whether or not it's going to get reimbursed post loan.
Yeah, and Scott, the only thing I was going to add to that is just when you start to get into this, and this is something that I highly, highly encourage. And we actually will in the instruction guide say that, if you submit an application without consulting your GFR first, it'll be automatically returned. There's certain aspects of the application portal that are still require the GFR to do some pre-work before you go into the application phase. And one of the things that we want to make sure is that you're not spending money on an area that isn't eligible. So I would say when you're initially getting started and looking at doing something under this program, reach out to your GFR if you're not sure who that is. You can reach out to the contact us. On our website, we have GFRs listed by state. You can reach out to any of them and say, hey, listen, I'm looking to do an infrastructure loan. I'd like a GFR connection so that I can start working on this. And the GFR can go through and do the eligibility review for where you're looking at going. The infrastructure program is not strictly, and actually it's not a broadband program. It's a telecommunications telephone program first and foremost. So in many cases, we're looking at not whether there's broadband in the area or not, but is there adequate telephone service? Under the program, and that we'll be doing some additional webinars and stuff like that, but under the program, that includes wireless. So infrastructure program can fund wireless, and there's certain eligibility requirements for wireless systems, and there's certain eligibility requirements for telephone systems. And so what the GFR can do is go out and do a non-duplication finding to determine if the area is even going to be eligible under the program. So the last thing we want you to do is go out and start hiring contractors and consultants and stuff like that for, say, environmental, if the area is not even going to be eligible. So your first step is really going to be looking at determining the area that you are. Now, if this is your existing ILEC or you're an existing borrower, then there's some waivers to the non-duplication if you're an existing borrower in an existing service area. The other thing is not all states still follow the old traditional ILEC area. Or we're looking at one right now where the state has basically gone away with the ILEC area. And under the regulation, we look at universal service support. So that can be Lifeline, Health Connect, high cost, E-rate. So some of these other areas, we also look at RDOF as a universal service support. So some of those can qualify you for the program. So there's a lot of flexibility within the infrastructure program based upon changes to how states look at telecommunications, those kind of things. Unlike Reconnect that has very strict kind of boundaries on as far as broadband, the infrastructure program doesn't have some of those same. It does have some broadband requirements as far as non-duplication and stuff like that, but there are some different ways through that if you're looking at an area that does not have adequate telephone service. So say you've got an area out there that's got great wireless service, but they're not offering any kind of interconnected VoIP or telephone service, that area may still be eligible for an infrastructure loan if there's not adequate phone service out there. So there's some things like that under the infrastructure program that you want to make sure you understand, because it's not as cut and dry as the simple Reconnect program that is just simply about broadband speeds and availability. The infrastructure program also has a separate rule identification. So Reconnect is 20,000, infrastructure is 5,000. However, there are some wiggle room in some of those areas depending upon whether the urban area is necessary and incidental to serving the rural area, or if you have an existing loan there, or you had built out that area when it was still under, say, 5,000 population. So there's some of those types of questions that really need to be answered before we can even kind of dig into the infrastructure loan program. And that's where your GFR is going to be able to guide you through that. And then once you start to look at, okay, we want to start looking at doing maybe a class 1 or pulling some different environmental information together, that's where your GFR can ensure that they work with our servicing department and our engineering department to make sure that you're setting stuff up correctly. So your GFR is really going to be your lifeline on this program. Whereas like Reconnect, we open a window, you grab consultants, you put everything together, you submit it, and it's scored and racked and stacked. Whereas the loan program is very much we want it to be very much a joint effort between us and the applicant to work through this process to get you something that you can actually move forward with, and not to be a cumbersome process that's overly bureaucratic. Let us be your bureaucratic interpreters and help you through this program. So I strongly encourage you, if you're looking at the infrastructure program, you think it's something that will work for an area, reach out to your local GFR and we'll walk you through the process and try to make this as simple as possible.
Excellent. Okay, we're starting to get lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question. So in the new portal, when you have to select type of loan, for example, cost of money, if you make a selection and then you decide that you want a different option, will you have to start a whole new application? Or is that something that you can change without impacting other sections? And I'll leave this to, I guess, Joan or Michael.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
I can take that one.
I'll go ahead and take this one because it's in
Oh,
the
you
system stuff,
okay.
so no worries. Yeah, hey, Amanda, I'm glad to hear from you. If you make the wrong selection, you're actually on the project information page. You can go back and change it there. It's not going to affect the rest of the application, nor will you have to start a new application. The only reason you would need to start a new application is if you make that choice on the step previous to project information. In other words, when you click that start application button and you step through a series of questions, one of which is about refinancing, if you make the wrong selection on refinancing, that's when you're going to have to start a new application. Otherwise, changing the selection of the loan type or the funding type on that project information page just gives us information up front. So when our reviewers get a hold of it, they know exactly which deferral periods, interest rates, things like that to apply to their analyses. So I hope that answers the question for you.
All right, excellent. Thank you. We'll move on to another question. Michael, I may hand this over to you or Scott. So is it required for a subsidiary to have independently audited financials?
And I can take this one.
From the parent.
So as far as the audited financials, those are required for existing RUS borrowers. However, we do like to see audited financials if you're coming into the program new. However, they're not a requirement. So the applicant is the one submitting the financials. The subsidiary, we will need the financial information on them, but an audit most likely would not be required on subsidiary unless there's some additional information needed, or if one is available.
Thank you so much, Michael. We'll move on to another question here. Does the infrastructure program and loans cover individual properties, or is this for rural area development? I'll throw that open to the panel.
So I'll take this one also. The infrastructure program is designed to provide telephone service to rural areas. So unless you're an existing RUS borrower with an existing loan in an area, where we know populations can grow, but there is a rule that's once rural, always rural. So if you had an existing loan and in an area where the population increased and you were coming back to do that same area, we would still consider it a rural area. But for the most part, if you're a new applicant coming to the program, you're going to have those rural requirements, with a few exceptions if the non-rural area is needed to make the loan feasible. But that gets into a little bit more complication when you go that route. So typically we're looking at rural areas with a population of 5,000 or less and providing phone service in those areas, connected phone service. So it can be VoIP, but the phone service has to be part of the infrastructure application. So I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next question, probably for Chris or Russ. Will applicants be able to modify their submitted responses to the environmental questionnaire should an award be made? Actually, this might be a Joan question as well.
Let me
once-
go ahead. Let me go
Yeah.
ahead and take a stab at this from the system perspective and then turn it over to Chris and Russ. Basically, you're not going to have to modify it unless we actually send your application back asking you to modify it. So you will have the ability to modify and resubmit, but it's going to be initiated by RUS. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Chris and Russ for when that might happen.
Yeah, I just want to add, thanks, Joan. This is Chris Collins. I just want to add, we are talking about the infrastructure loan program here. And I know a lot of people, well, my thought process is a lot of people is probably still thinking about Reconnect and how those were done. So infrastructure program doesn't have a open close window. So you can file the infrastructure application at any given time and work on it. One thing that we've historically done with infrastructure applications is sometimes we've even had the environmental cleared before the application got submitted or finalized. So what I recommend is if you got your plan together, whatever you're doing, and if you get the environmental piece ready to go, we can start review of that before you submit your application. And then we may have things coming back and forth. And so therefore the final pieces that may be looked at will be in your application when it's submitted. But otherwise, to Joan's point, and Russ, you can jump in here, if the environmental piece people find something that needs to be added, we can always get it added after submission.
That's correct. I'll be the review portion is I'll be reviewing, and others will be reviewing those applications, those projects. And if we find things missing, we're actually able to return that project with a very specific description of the things that we need in order to move it all the way through environmental.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Next question we'll move on to. Any limitation on utilizing infrastructure loan for an area under an enforceable commitment, such as BEAD? I don't know, Shekinah, Scott, Michael, one of you want to jump in there, perhaps?
So there are some limitations. It depends on what is going on with it. And like I said, the infrastructure program is a telephone program. So we have looked into this initially. And if, say, an infrastructure borrower, say we have a telephone company that is looking to build out one of their areas and they got a BEAD award over top of it, that's still technically an eligible area for telephone service. Now, we may not be able to fund broadband components of the loan, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't self-fund some of those types of things. But as far as going into a new area, if you're going into, so we do have the ability to go in for an infrastructure telecommunication provider to go into a new area. Now we do have to do PNR, PNF. It's not one of your existing service areas. And that could then kick it out. So it would be ineligible under, say, a new area. But if it's an existing service area and you're upgrading your existing service, then there's some eligibility there. So it's really going to come down to the characteristics of the situation. And that's where it's important to reach out to your GFR and gather the information with them on the non-duplication finding, and then potentially the PNR, PNF process if that's going to be needed. So that's something that we can actually work with you. And that's why I said, if you've got an area in mind that you're looking at, it doesn't hurt for you to reach out to your GFR and say, hey, can we look at this area? We're looking at doing non-duplication. I know we've done this recently in the past where somebody was looking at an area and we were able to work with them and say, we don't think that this area right here will be eligible, but these other areas potentially are. Would you be willing to proceed with this? And then we could do the non-duplication finding on that. Because there's two statutory requirements that we have, and that's the non-duplication and the PNR, PNF. Now the PNR, PNF doesn't have, under Reconnect, we have a limitation is we can't duplicate more than 10%. Under infrastructure, it does not have that requirement, but we do have to go through financial feasibility, and we have to prove that if we're going to build something out, that it's necessary, financially feasible to do that. But we have to go through the non-duplication finding under statute, and the non-duplication is based upon telephone service. So there are some nuances to this that it's not a straight yes or no question, and that's why, because there's multiple paths that you can go down under the non-duplication finding, depending upon the situation, the state rules, the enforceable commitment, some of those other issues that we have, that we really, the only clear path through that is to work with your local GFR to do that before you start, really going too far down the road of preparing an application. And that's something that it doesn't necessarily isn't going to be a huge lift for you. We're going to ask for some basic information, the area, those kind of things, and the GFR start putting stuff together to actually go through and look at that non-duplication finding for an area. So that's really the cleanest answer I can give you on that. It's going to be very case specific.
Excellent. Thank you, Shikana. Next question, Michael, maybe for you. When will the program go live for the next funding round? Also, will loan guarantees be available?
So as far as when the portal will open up with the new updates, I believe the date on that is this Thursday, 12/18. As far as loan guarantees, we will have FFB money, which is Federal Financing Bank. It's a guaranteed sort of loan, but as like guaranteeing a loan made by a private bank outside of that. Right now, I don't believe there is funding for that category. Shikana, you might want to correct me on that.
Yeah, that's correct. So when we look at it, when we get funding for guaranteed money, that's FFB, which is a federal financing bank. And so that's something where we go through the underwriting process and we work with FFB for that guaranteed loan. You can work with your local GFR as far as cost of money versus FFB, which is the two funding pots. If you look at the legislation that we're given $350 million in FFB, $200 million in FFB, $350 million in cost of money. The FFB, we add an 1/8% to the federal interest rate. You can do headquarters buildings underneath that, whereas the cost of money is at Treasury rates, and it's directly from Treasury, but you can't do headquarters buildings. There's a few other nuances between the two, but there's really the legal agreement at the end is a little different because we have to use the FFB, and then FFB you can actually select your, even though you have, say, an amortization on the loan of, say, 20 years, you can actually pick your loan rate. So if you want to go with a 90-day revolving, some of those types of things, FFB gives you some flexibility to do that. And that's technically considered guaranteed, but we don't have money if you go out to, say, Bank of America to guarantee that type of a loan. So it's not your traditional rural development guarantee that I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Great, thank you. We are unfortunately running out of time here. We'll try to squeeze in one more question. Apologies if we can't get to your question, but again, please reach out to staff and GFR after the webinar. All right, can an infrastructure loan be submitted for middle mile only, no subscribers along the way, but transporting traffic to the outside world?
So I'll take this one and then possibly pass it off to Shikana. Keep in mind, infrastructure is for telephone service. So you have to provide telephone service for it to be eligible. So with that definition alone, if you just had a middle mile with no subscribers, you could tie to it from a telephone perspective, that would not be eligible. Shikana, I'll let you elaborate if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, what I think a lot of people think as middle mile is not something that we traditionally fund. We have funded, common network facilities between, to say, two exchange areas. Someone needs a more robust route to connect two of their existing service areas, provide that backbone. Those are things that we can do. But a traditional, if you're going to run, say, from Kansas City to St. Louis as a middle mile project and connect 5 different telephone companies along the line, that wouldn't be something that the infrastructure program has the capacity to do. So it's really going to depend upon what you're considering, what you're looking at as far as that common network or middle mile facility. But we don't in telecom traditionally. Our focus has always been on the end user. While I know middle mile can boost end user, service, it's always what we can fund is always part of the whole in that last mile.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for today's webinar. Apologies again if we did not get to your question. Please reach out to staff and your GFR for assistance. We will have a 508 compliant version of the recording available here in the near future for you to view or for others to view in case they were not able to attend today's webinar. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Have a great day.